Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. It's great to have so many people with us so swiftly. There's still lots of people joining us, so looking forward to a really, really good session today. To those who are new to the Social Housing Roundtable, my name is Matt Baird. I've been running this now for 3.5 years. The idea was to bring people together every single week to have a conversation around some of the key themes in housing. I've always wondered kind of how long this would run for, thinking if we were doing it every Tuesday at 11 a.m, eventually we'd run out. But we've only got about 3 sessions that still have gaps this year, and we've already got about 6 of the sessions next year booked. So it turns out that there's a lot of appetite for this, which is fantastic. And we have everybody from tenants right through to chief execs and sector consultants and frontline housing staff and everybody with us. So it's fantastic to see this community ever growing. Day to day, I'm a social housing recruiter. I've recruited in housing for over 11 years. I've been self-employed for 3.5 years. And the idea behind that is to make sure that anybody who attends these, if you are looking for recruitment support, please do reach out, because it keeps this running free and keeps us open as that open forum for anybody and everybody. This is a respectful space. I don't have any problem at all with people disagreeing with each other. In fact, usually that's encouraged. However, just make sure it's kept respectful, and we're mindful of that at all times, whether you're brand new to housing or 20 years of experience. I still want to hear your views equally. And to those who've noticed, I have joined a firm called Spirehouse Recruitment as of yesterday, so I'm still self-employed. But I've joined those guys. A bit more on those coming soon, but I've got additional support on the social housing recruitment side, but we've also got a team there who support with legal recruitment and HR recruitment. So if you are looking for wider support, do reach out. So on to today. I'm delighted to welcome Devonshire's to the forum. They have sponsored today's session, so a massive, massive thank you to them. Alert Call are our annual sponsor, but Devonshire's is sponsoring this and a series of 3 other sessions over the next few months. More details on that soon. I met Gemma, I think at a networking event or something a while back, and then we partnered. I'm co-chair of the board for Spring Housing in Birmingham, and she helped us with our recent merger with St Anne's to help us become a registered provider. So that was a really interesting process to go through after only being a chair for about 8 months. So thanks for all your support there. And she's also brought Sharon with her today. So I'm going to pass over to Gemma and Sharon to introduce themselves, introduce Devonshire's, and introduce the key theme of mergers, which is obviously why everyone's joined us today. So without further ado, Gemma, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. You might need to turn your volume up a bit. You may be able to hear I'm a bit croaky today. Spent far too much time shouting at my husband over the weekend, clearly, and it's not paid off. So thankfully, Sharon's come today to help me. So Sharon's a senior associate in my team as well at Devonshire's. I'll share the slides in a minute, just a bit of background about us. So hopefully most of you will have heard of us. So we are a law firm. We've been operating in the sector for over 50 years. We operate nationally and across Wales and Northern Ireland. I largely focus on governance, regulatory, corporate work within the social housing sector. So whether that's looking at a corporate joint venture or collapsing a group structure or purchasing a company, so whether it's a kind of a gas servicing company, or as we're going to talk about today, mergers, not murders, as my daughter always thinks I say, but mergers is what we're talking about today, because it's been the bedrock of what I've been focusing on, particularly for the last kind of 5 years, I would say, in the sector. So I will kick off. Let me just share some slides. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we can have a good chat hopefully at the end. Let me just share my screen. Is that showing up for everybody?
That's great. Yep.
Lovely. Thank you. So I think the first thing I wanted to say was mergers aren't a new phenomenon. It may seem like, they're on every conference agenda at the moment. There's always something inside housing about someone considering a merger or dropping out of a merger, but it's definitely not a new thing in the sector. So I've been around, I would say, I think it's my 18th year in social housing this year, which is interesting. And some of the first projects I worked on were mergers. And I always say fondly to Sharon, one of my first mergers I worked on was Bourneville Works Housing Society going into Bourneville Village Trust, and I remember it very well because at every meeting we would get chocolate from the factory shop, and sadly I don't get that very often now. I'm current mergers I'm working on, but it was a great way to go into the sector. But I think so mergers, been around for a long time. Back in the day, some of the first ones I worked on, Accord with Moseley and District, various ones going on at that time. So it's definitely not a new thing, but I think the scale of mergers has definitely increased, both in terms of the number that we've got going on at the moment in the sector, coupled with the number of respective discussions that are happening at the moment, but also the size of the merged organisations that are being created. As you're aware, 10 years ago, a large organisation was 40,000 units. Now a large organisation is plus 80, really, so we are talking about huge organisations that are being created ultimately as a result of these mergers. And there are different things that you will see referred to in the social housing press. So there are some rescues, certainly. So one of the ones I'll talk about in a minute, Guinness Shepherd's Bush, which we completed last year, was ultimately a rescue. Shepherd's Bush was in a strained financial situation and in regulatory difficulty. It needed to find someone to partner with where it would have that ability to shore up its finances and ultimately improve its resilience going forward. And there are others in that situation, particularly driven by investment needs around building safety, stock quality, etc. So there are certainly rescues. Acquisitions is a term that certain social housing publications like to use a lot, and it tends to be where you're looking at subsidiary structures, so where one is becoming a subsidiary of the other, and that is a very common model and has been increasingly common, particularly over the last kind of 5 years, I would say, either as a stage one of the merger process where you then look to fully merge in due course, or as the ultimate structure that you achieve. So an example of that would be Riverside One Housing Group. One Housing Group initially went in as a subsidiary of the Riverside Group and then collapsed in to Riverside itself by way of a transfer of engagements last year. So we do see quite a lot of that. And then you'll see various conversations about mergers of equals, which is the kind of pinnacle of where providers come together and seek to create something new through merger, either a brand new legal structure or operating under new branding, new logo and things like that. So we are seeing that happening all the time, and there are different legal structures and different terms used, really, but ultimately it's about two housing providers or two housing provider groups coming together to form one legally. So as I said, the scale and number of mergers has increased, and I think some of the drivers for that are clearly about how you make sure you have a resilient business that can really maintain viability against the shocks that we're seeing in the sector. And I think the frequency of those shocks and the scale of those shocks has certainly increased from, rent cuts, rent caps, zero carbon requirements, investment requirements around building safety, the impact of the financial markets. The shocks that we are facing as businesses are ever increasing, and the kind of fat that we have on the bones to be able to deal with that has decreased over the last 10 years in particular. And so what providers are looking at is how can we be resilient as a business going forward so that we aren't constantly having to go back to the drawing board of revisiting the business plan, and in some cases it's been providers have been looking at selling off assets in order to maintain their viability going forward, and clearly that's not something you can do on an ongoing basis. So it's about how do we make sure that we can achieve our strategic objectives without having to constantly kind of keep going with the begging bowl and trying to think what we can do. And then the other thing is obviously balancing trade-offs. So we hear it over and over again about, development versus investment. And sadly, that is a choice that we have to make at the moment. I sit on the board of a housing association, and we've had that difficult conversation about, are we cutting back development altogether? How do we make sure that we balance that against the investment that we need to make in our homes to make sure we're providing a quality service to our residents? And one of the ways to think about how you can deliver a greater balance of those trade-offs so that you can still deliver new homes and address the housing crisis is to look at merger and some of the additionality that can bring. Another thing is about increasing impact, and particularly in certain local authority areas. Coming together can mean that you are a bigger player in a certain geographical area, and therefore you have more of a sway when it comes to things like local authorities, planning, etc., negotiations with developers. And so that has been one of the drivers for a number of mergers. And then lastly, I've just mentioned the skills and personnel, and there's a range of issues here. Some is about the ability to attract talent and also to retain good talent, particularly when you're competing not just against people in the social housing sector, but also commercial developers, care providers, etc. So it's about having that attractive offering. I think the other thing that we're seeing is levels of executive burnout, and the fact that, people can't necessarily continue to cope with the constant stresses and kind of shocks being thrown at them through the sector, whether that's through reputational issues, investigations into quality of provision. Some have just said, we can't continue on this basis, and that is still driving mergers to a certain extent, which is somewhat ironic given the kind of telling off the sector got however many years ago about this shouldn't be about chief execs looking at their retirement plan when you look at a merger, but it's ultimately driving. You need someone at the top of the business to drive it forward, and so it's about how you get there. So just in terms of some recent activity, I put some examples on there. So you may be aware of the Bromford flagship merger, and some of the reasons on that are highlighted there. So it's really about delivering, additional financial capacity, looking at developing additional homes, and the number quoted there is 2,000 homes additional every year over the next 30 years. So potentially 60,000 homes there. And a big focus on those being at social rent rather than necessarily shared ownership. There's Longhurst Group looking at a merger at the moment with Grand Union, which you've seen advertised in the press. And again, talking about how you unlock capacity to invest more in homes and neighbourhoods, so existing homes, but also to deliver additional homes over the next 5 years. There's Wrekin Housing Group and Housing Plus, who are in merger conversations at the moment. And again, thinking about additionality there, what can we do to create more in an area? They've got a clear geographical overlap in terms of where they're working across Shropshire and Staffordshire. And then Shepherd's Bush, I've just put that one on there, which is the one we completed last December. And that was where Shepherd's Bush became a subsidiary of the Guinness Partnership. And again, that was linked to viability and governance regulatory concerns around Shepherd's Bush in particular that drove that forward. So I'm going to hand over to Sharon now, who's going to talk a bit about different options other than merger that can be looked at when you're thinking about collaboration.
Thanks, Gemma. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So we wanted to start just talking about other collaboration options. Whilst most of this session will be talking about mergers, it's also useful to think about some other methods of collaboration that we see in the sector. As Gemma mentioned, collaboration amongst organisations is nothing new, and that goes for the whole piece, the whole spectrum of collaboration. There are new drivers for collaboration, as Gemma's mentioned, for example, the challenging operating environment in the sector. Also, we've seen things like the NHF code actively including principles around organisations considering their options for collaboration and how they can achieve their strategic goals through collaboration. So it's important to think of collaboration in the wider piece, and it's not just nothing and merger. There's lots in between for organisations to think about. We've popped on this slide a bit of a spectrum of collaboration. There's lots of other circles that we could have included, but this is kind of a simple diagram to take you through from informal collaboration right through to your most formal mergers. If we look at informal partnerships, this will often involve organisations coming together informally, whether that's through working in a certain neighbourhood or having some kinds of shared communal areas and things. So having that kind of informal partnership where two housing associations might work together, you might have a contract in place for that or some kind of arrangement, but sometimes that can just be informal ways of working, organisations partnering with each other to achieve a specific need. Moving on to more formal collaboration models, this is where we start seeing the increased use of contracts, for example, or some kind of formal framework put in place between organisations. Often we see formal collaboration models in this sphere around, for example, management arrangements. So where an organisation might enter into a management agreement with another housing association to manage stock on their behalf in certain areas, and organisations can collaborate in that way. In the middle there, we've got cost sharing vehicles, so cost or service sharing vehicles, and we could do a whole presentation just based on the, technicalities around setting up those kinds of arrangements. I think I'm just going to cover it on a headline basis today, but what essentially that involves is, multiple organisations coming together to set up a special purpose vehicle, essentially, where they can share costs for a certain service, for example, and the benefit of that being that there can be certain tax and VAT efficiencies that can be driven from having those kinds of arrangements in place. There are lots of technical rules around how that arrangement needs to be structured so that it fits the requirements of HMRC and the regulator, for example. But we have seen cost sharing vehicles as a method of collaboration in the sector. For example, Wandle has been looking at a cost sharing vehicle around procurement services. We've talked to clients around cost sharing vehicles for other areas such as legal services even. So they are something that are being explored by different organisations, again, to meet the challenging need. Gemma mentioned, for example, skills and personnel shortages, and it's thought that cost-sharing vehicles can help alleviate some of those concerns when we have issues in the sector around, you know, being able to fully resource a development team, for example, resource a legal team. So that's another method that organisations can collaborate together. Next, moving more into the formal realm where we've got joint ventures. Joint ventures, again, can, you know, range from informal joint ventures to the more formal joint ventures. If we look at contractual joint ventures, for example, they're on the less formal side of things, and that usually involves partners coming together and having a contract in place, basically, that sets out how they're going to work together. These types of arrangements tend to be either issue or project specific, and they'll tend to be for a shorter term, where you'll have, you know, a less formal arrangement in place where it's just governed by a contract. You might think of this with a housing association partnering, say, for example, with a local developer for some units on a site. So yeah, it's very issue and project specific, and it would be something more short term. On the flip side of that, you can have a corporate joint venture, and this involves setting up new corporate entities, for example, limited liability partnerships or other kinds of corporate structures in place that will kind of underpin the joint venture relationship between the parties. And joint ventures can be between housing association to housing association. It can be housing association with a commercial housing developer. It can be with a local authority. It could be with the NHS, for example. So, you know, you can have different range of partners. With a corporate joint venture, these are often for more complex projects, for example, regeneration schemes or projects that are going to go on for a longer period of time. And the whole point with joint ventures is, again, for the parties to come together. They can share resources, they can share skills, they can also then share the risk, essentially. So there's, you know, the apportionment of risk. It can be something that is talked about in the joint venture of how risk will be split between organisations. And the aim is to collaborate to then achieve a goal that, you know, the parties can't achieve by themselves. Sometimes joint ventures can also be used as almost a test to merger. So we have seen organisations that have partnered together and then possibly a few years down the line have looked at merging together in different ways. So that's another way that joint ventures can be used. And then lastly, as we're going to talk about for the rest of the presentation, we have mergers where, you know, two or more organisations are coming together to formally merge, to formally create one group or an entity, depending on what form of merger that they use. So on this slide, we've talked about form follows function. And what we're essentially talking about here is that when organisations are considering mergers and considering what type of structure they want to use or why they want to merge in the first place, the important thing here is to think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Figure that out, and then the form will follow that. You shouldn't necessarily be hooked on a, you know, specific structure or type without thinking about why you want to do it, because often the reasons behind a merger or any type of collaboration are what's going to inform the most appropriate structure that you're going to adopt or the form that you're going to adopt going forwards. So on this slide, we've got some important questions that are worth considering. For example, what are you trying to achieve? Why are you doing this in the first place? There needs to be a why, there needs to be a reason for it. Oftentimes when you're approaching any form of collaboration, but in particular a merger, organisations will have to put together a business case for this merger. So understanding the whys and wherefores are very important and will be central to that business case. You need to think about what your strengths are. So for you as an organisation, what are you bringing to the table? What are your strengths? But also, what are your weaknesses? So potentially, you know, what is a weakness for your organisation? And is that something that you want to look for in a partner? For example, do you have a specific need around your development team or a certain function, and that's what you're looking for? You're looking for a partner that's going to help bolster that function in your organisation. that links to what needs to improve. So again, what's going to be the benefit that's going to be driven from this merger, from this collaboration? What is the tangible benefit that you can demonstrate will be achieved by doing this as opposed to not doing this? Then thinking about what cannot be weakened. So kind of your sacred cows, your red lines, what's working really well for you that you do not want to sacrifice or to be weakened. For example, are you a really good place-based provider and you want to maintain that culture in your organisation? Is that very important to you? Do you have a very ambitious development plan, for example, and you don't want the merger to adversely impact that? So thinking about, for your organisation, what cannot be weakened, because that also will help with the alignment further down the process and ensuring you get the right partner. And then lastly, thinking about the potential hurdles and barriers. So can you think of these at the outset and how these can either be dealt with or mitigated moving forwards, so you can clear the process for the merger to take place? We'll talk a little bit more about due diligence and the role that has in identifying potential barriers in a couple of slides, but it's always important to make sure that those issues are also dealt with.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to talk a bit about the why now, which Sharon's already mentioned, but I think this is the really crucial thing, as in a merger doesn't achieve anything by itself. You should ultimately have a purpose that you're trying to achieve through the merger, and you should constantly be going back to test against this. We always say to boards, you've got to understand ultimately, is doing this in the best interest of your organisation, as opposed to staying alone, looking at a joint venture, looking at some other form of collaboration, and keep testing against that objective. One thing that gets mentioned a lot is cultural fit. So when partners looking at each other, we're a good cultural fit. I think there are some things you have to look about how you test that. And what does a good culture look like to you? So is it about service delivery to your residents? I would hope so. What are the things that are fundamental around that for us? Is it about how your staff are treated? Is it about scores you get back on certain surveys? So how are you testing that culture? Because it's an easy thing to throw out there, but I think it can be a very hard thing to test in practice. In terms of the why, some of the recent ones have been a kind of now or never, as in we either do it now where we're in a really great position and we can go out and find someone that will be a good fit for us and we are in a kind of strong bargaining position, or do we wait and then we might not be in such a great place to do that? So it's quite an interesting one in terms of some of the drivers we've seen about people looking at beauty parades in terms of conversations with potential partners. Benefits of scale, I've touched on this earlier in terms of impact, but benefits of being in a big organisation in terms of efficiencies you can create, procurement benefits you can get, also just in terms of your negotiating power with third parties, whether that's local authorities, funders, etc. Clearly generating capacity to do more, and I talked about that when I talked about some of the examples we've got out there at the moment in terms of live conversations happening around mergers, but that could be capacity to do more in terms of delivering a better service, delivering wider services you can't deliver at the minute. You may not merge with a housing association, you might merge with a domestic violence charity because you want to bolster a service that you want to provide in that area. But also, development is a clear one. But generally thinking about what do we want to do more of and how could we achieve that? I've talked about skills and retention and attraction of good people, and that is something that is driving quite a few mergers at the moment. Services should be key, and that's got to be an underlying in every why. What's the ultimate impact of this in terms of the services we're providing to our residents? Will they be getting better? They definitely shouldn't be getting worse. And if they're getting better, how much better are we expecting? And is that worth it in the overall round of this conversation? And Sharon mentioned about, you're looking at what your weaknesses are, but how how will the merger help to address that in terms of strengthening those weaknesses? You'll hear me say again and again in the conversation today that you shouldn't underestimate the amount of resource that goes into delivering a merger. There will be a distraction from business as usual, and it's got to be worth it at the end of the day in terms of what you're going to be achieving through the benefits. So there has to be that understanding. I think ultimately the why has to be linked to service delivery, reducing your risks as a business and really kind of improving your resilience to deliver what you've been set up to do. And that has to constantly be tested. In terms of testing it, and you'll hear loads of people say, well, what mergers ever really tested the benefits that they said they were set out to achieve? And I will say there's not many I know that's ever kind of formally gone back and gone, 5 years ago we said we're going to do this, where are we now? But there should be some testing around, have we been able to develop the homes? If not, why not? Have we seen an improvement in terms of service quality? And that has to be tested afterwards, but also has to be tested throughout the merger process, because issues will come up. Particularly on due diligence, we always see things come up. There is no such thing as a person who doesn't have any skeletons in their closet as an organisation. So there will be things that come out. And really, for the boards in particular, they have to keep testing, is this still in the best interest? Are we still going to be able to achieve the why? If the why has to change, is it still worth it? And constantly testing that throughout is really important. As I said before, thinking about, if we're doing this, what aren't we doing? And what will be the impact in terms of delivering normal services? And you have to make sure that you're still delivering your services as a landlord. That cannot be negatively impacted in terms of delivering the merger. In terms of costs, you've got to think about consent costs. There will be consent costs payable, particularly to lenders, and that has to be built into the business case in terms of assessing, the overall costs and the benefits of the merger. And also thinking about what you're inheriting and how much that's going to cost to sort out. We see a variety of things, and we'll talk about some lessons learned in a minute, but whether it's, rent standard issues where you may have potential refunds to residents, it could be things around sorting out compliance issues on health and safety. What's the cost of that, and how is that being factored into the business case overall? I think in terms of testing the why, one thing that we see happening again and again is, do you know that meme where you've got two people standing and they're looking at a 6 and a 9? So they both think they're looking at the same thing, and actually they're looking at something different from different perspectives. Quite often on health and safety compliance, we see this. People think that they are taking the same approach and are compliant in the same way. And actually that's not the case. That's not true. Similarly on business plans, testing how people are modelling their business plans and assessing their current business plans. Are you taking the same approach? There has to be that consistency. So quite often, and what I'd usually expect, particularly on the bigger mergers, is we will see an independent third party come in and do that modelling process and that testing process to make sure the assumptions are the same, the figures add up from both perspectives, and you can both be happy that you are gaining additionality through proceeding with the merger. Sharon's mentioned about options before. Merger is not the only option. In some cases, it's not the best option either. So thinking about what the different options are and thoroughly reviewing those as part of the business case is really important, so that you can show and your boards can show that doing this is ultimately the best thing for your organisation. And I think remaining open around that, we have seen some mergers where structures have had to change mid-process because, for example, funder conversations have not gone as hoped, and therefore, in order to achieve the savings required and not incur additional costs, we've had to change the structure and the approach being taken. I think remaining open throughout is really important, not only in terms of things needing to change and adapt as the process goes on, but also being open to challenge and not being defensive. As I said before, things will come out of the cupboard. There will be different approaches you have taken. There may be challenges around decisions that have been made by respective organisations as part of the merger process. And you have to be open for conversations and questions around that. Because, ultimately you're going into a merger based on trust, and there has to be that openness as part of the process. The last bullet point, it's the magic question, and we get asked over and over again, is bigger always better? Is bigger always worse? Or is it sometimes the same? I think, I have my views. I think any merger, if managed well, if the business case stacks up, you will deliver financial additionality. You always have to test that against the services that you're ultimately going to be providing. And I think thinking about how you don't ultimately weaken the strengths you both have at the beginning is something that's really essential, because otherwise you are going to end up with 2 + 2 = 4 or 3, and really you should be thinking about how can we approach things differently and learn from each other, so ultimately we are strengthening things going forward. I don't think bigger is always worse, but I think some of the mergers that we've seen which have created very big organisations, coupled with the massive focus on savings, has ultimately meant the eye has been taken off the ball in terms of what are we providing to our residents, how are we making sure that our customers are happy. I don't think that's just a merger issue. I think that is a sector issue, as we've seen. But I think, in mergers, there is a huge focus on cost cutting, savings. And I think in some cases it's gone too far in terms of how certain services have been delivered. And we've seen the impact of that through, high profile articles and things in the sector. Sharon?
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys, and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler, and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare, and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
Sorry, I was just having some problems unmuting myself. Thanks, Gemma. I'm going to bring it back to a bit of a kind of the context around mergers as well now, just for some background really of what we're talking about when we're talking about mergers in the housing sector, particularly in the not-for-profit housing sector. It is a very different context to mergers and acquisitions in the, normal, in inverted commas, corporate commercial world. When we're talking about mergers in the not-for-profit housing sector, we are talking about mergers between not-for-profit entities, and there isn't a price paid like you would see, for example, with mergers that we see in the, everyday general press, for example, the takeover of Twitter, or, other organisations merging together, for example, even the house builders that are merging. Because there is no price paid, there is also no warranties or any disclosures given in the usual way. I will talk about what kind of disclosures in terms of due diligence that we do carry out in mergers for the sector, but you don't have the same, list of warranties that are given. So essentially, the parties are relying on the information that is disclosed. There is an element of trust that the parties are being open and honest and telling each other everything that they're supposed to be telling, and being fully open when answering the questions that they're being asked. And that is on an open book basis. So there has to be a good level of trust between the organisations when doing that, because you are essentially relying on the credibility of the information you're being given to review. Linked to that, there are very few demergers in the sector as well. So when organisations do merge, there's very few demergers. And, in my time in the sector, I think I'm on 7 or 8 years now, Gemma. I think I've come across one which actually Gemma worked on with a Cobalt coming out of the group structure that it was in. I would say though that demerger was very fact specific to the arrangements that were in place for that organisation, and oftentimes we just don't see that anymore with demergers in the sector. So oftentimes once a merger happens, you won't see parties necessarily coming out of those arrangements. It also does depend on what kind of structures in place to implement the merger in the first place, so that's something to be mindful of. In terms of due diligence, whilst it isn't a merger in the corporate commercial sense, with that kind of consideration passing hands, parties do still need to carry out due diligence on each other. And that due diligence can be a mix of operational, financial, legal. Also, we see more and more cultural due diligence being taken out about parties, so reviewing one another's businesses. And as I mentioned, this is reliant on the information that's provided. So organisations often provide information to each other for them to review. Organisations might also engage professional third parties like lawyers, accountants, for example, to review information and report to the boards of organisations on what they found. Due diligence, essentially, the role it plays for a merger between not-for-profit housing organisations is firstly to ascertain what's going on, how the business stacks up, who your organisation, your target organisation, your partner says they are, do those expectations stack up? What are the risks? Are there risks that are emerging, and can those risks be mitigated or managed, or are there big red flags that mean there's a hurdle now for this merger to take place? And also linked to those risks, are there also then issues that are being presented, which means the perceived benefits for this merger, so what you're hoping to achieve actually might not be achieved based on the information that you've reviewed from your due diligence. So due diligence is still a very important tool as part of the merger process, because it allows both partners to understand their, the counterpart organisation in more detail, and understand who they're essentially partnering with. Sometimes we call it as like, the intense dating period of, before a marriage, where you're finding out about each other and you're getting that information. And also through the due diligence process, often counterparties are talking to each other, so you can also get a bit of a feel around the culture, around how each other treats compliance, for example, or how information is recorded. So you can get some of that softer information from the exercise as well. So now on to what can go wrong. So Gemma's going to talk about some lessons learned from recent mergers, but if I just firstly just talk on a headline level of what can go wrong, what we see. Often it's very rarely a technical issue that will arise and can derail a process. And when we say what can go wrong, it doesn't just mean, the merger falls down, but also just as in what can be a barrier or a hurdle that has to be overcome in a merger process. Gemma's already mentioned that mergers are resource intensive. They require a lot of planning. So oftentimes organisations might have difficulties where, that resource is being taken away from the business as usual, and the impact that it's having on, the ordinary day-to-day operations and the running. Because organisations, you still have to comply with your duties and responsibilities as landlords and provide that high-level service. So it's about having to balance the resource being taken away to deal with the merger against the business as usual operations. Understanding the clarity of the expectations is also really important. So Gemma mentioned that analogy of, looking at a number and one seeing a 6 and one seeing a 9. So understanding that expectation of what the parties are trying to achieve is really important, because that can really help shape the conversations further down the line. And it's not just the expectations party to party, so organisations to organisation, but also within an organisation itself. So your board's expectations compared to your exec teams or expectations, or your frontline staff. So making sure there's clear alignment there. Linked to that, there can be a loss of confidence or trust. So throughout the discussions, discussions might break down, and there is that loss of confidence or trust amongst the parties. I've already explained that oftentimes due diligence is, is underpinned by having a high level of trust. So trust is very important in this merger process. So where we do see difficulties is where there might be miscommunication, or that feeling that, the trust isn't really there anymore. Pace can also be an issue, so either going too fast, where organisations cannot meet the demand of the merger because it's moving too quickly, or also if it goes too slow, so you're losing momentum, you're losing some of, you're not really gaining the benefits because it's going too slow across the process. So thinking about, not just going too fast, but also is it possibly too slow, and meaning that you might not achieve some of these benefits because it's going too slowly. And then lastly, the culture and behaviours. So sometimes we've seen organisations that have embarked on a merger process, and then it's come to light that actually the cultural fit isn't quite there. I've mentioned, for example, in due diligence, there might be conversations had where it's appreciated that there's very different approaches to compliance, or how things are recorded, and or just how systems are operating, or how staff provide services. So that cultural fit doesn't necessarily align, and it's not quite as strong as it might have been anticipated right at the beginning. So that's another issue we sometimes see with the merger processes.
Thanks, Sharon. So I'm going to rattle through some lessons learned, and I've seen there's a couple of people on the conversation who have been through mergers either with me or have kind of shared their woes with me, so I'm hoping they'll share their woes as well today. Lesson learned, being realistic about strengths and weaknesses. I've talked about this already. Take an honest look in the mirror. What do we do well? What do we not do well? What do they do better than us? What do we need to learn? And I think you're not going to be perfect at everything. We put this corporate spiel out there in the world, but there are weaknesses we all have to address. So I think understanding that is really important, because how else are you going to deliver a realistic business case for how you're improving things when coming together as an organisation? I've talked about getting the why right till the cows come home, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but it is something that constantly has to be tested against throughout the process. And you can't lose sight of that. And ultimately, if the why doesn't add up, you should be saying no. You know, and we have had that conversation with some boards where we've had to say, are you happy this is still the right thing to do? And it can be hard, particularly when you spent, you know, a lot of money on due diligence or getting consents and things, and then you have to turn around and say, we're not doing this, but sometimes that is the right decision. Managing people and other stakeholders, your staff are so important. I don't know how much we talk about this so much with people when they're looking at merging. How do you make sure you manage your staff well so they don't feel disheartened or concerned they're going to lose their job, or that, you know, they're being ignored in the process? Because ultimately they're the ones out there delivering the service to your residents. And if they're not happy, that is going to show in the services that are being provided. But also, you know, they are the lifeblood of your business. So making sure you manage people well is really important. There will be various things and nuances that we have to work through, whether that's, you know, how you make sure certain key people are retained in the business and you don't lose them, you know, whether that's golden handcuffs and all kinds of mechanisms that we use. There are various things we do there, but that's a really key thing. But also other stakeholders, you know, you do not want to annoy your local authorities by forgetting to tell them about the merger and then they find out in the press and things, you know. So there are key things that you have to think about how you're managing that stakeholder relationship throughout the process and managing it appropriately. Due diligence, Sharon's touched on already. I mean, some of the key lessons we've seen on mergers where people have got downgrades after mergers is that due diligence has not been done well, has not been done accurately enough. Don't get me wrong, it's a really hard balance because it can be a very expensive and resource intensive process. But there are certain key things that have to be looked at as part of due diligence processes. And, you know, without wanting to do myself out of a job, it's not necessarily the legal stuff. The things you need to be looking at is how good is the data we've got? How well do we know the stock condition? How well are we complying with health and safety on both sides? Where there are issues, do we know what they are? Clearly, you know, what's the position on complaints? What's the position on disrepair claims? That's a key indicator in terms of how things have been delivered through the organisations and will feed into what you need to do in terms of coming together to make sure you're delivering a good organisation. And I've put implementing the findings because you would be shocked at the amount of DD processes that I have seen over 18 years. Not recently, I will say I've got a lot better, but where there were massive gaps left and no one ever finished off those areas of due diligence. You know, it was just like we need to also look at this, full stop. Okay, well, did anyone look at it? No, they didn't. Or things have been found in the action plan and then have not been implemented. And we have seen some people getting downgrades because ultimately they didn't implement the actions from due diligence. And it's a really key thing because if you know there's an issue, you can't just ignore it. You know, you have to make sure it's being dealt with. I've talked about data and particularly stock quality data, and more on mergers now we see independent testing of stock quality and the data held on that, and then also IT in terms of how IT systems work. And again, not wanting to do myself out of the importance of my role, to be honest, IT is so crucial on mergers. It's always the thing that holds things up. It's always the thing that takes much longer than anyone ever expects. And it's, you know, unbelievably complicated given that quite a lot of people use the same systems as well, but even bringing them together is very, very hard. So planning around IT and the implementation of IT issues is really key, and thankfully not something I have to get involved in at all, other than making sure it's on someone's project plan and someone's dealing with it. So that's great for me. Integration planning. We always joke we're a bit like the midwives, you know, we hand the baby over, congratulations, and then we leave you with all the really horrible hard work to do. As I've said to Matt, I'm sure in training sessions, you know, we take all the glory of completion and then we walk away and leave you to do all the really hard bits of actually making the two organisations work as one together. So planning for integration is essential, and obviously that covers a massive range of areas, from how you make sure your staff are working together properly, to policies and procedures, to IT systems, to making sure rent increase notices go out in the right name. There's a massive range of things that have to be covered within that, but it is really essential. And more now on mergers, we are seeing kind of integration committees being formed for a period of 18 months to 2 years after merger, because you need someone who's really got the kind of line of sight on that, is the bulldog, making sure that is being delivered in practice and not being strayed from. And it's really, really key. Otherwise, you're not going to deliver the benefits of the merger at all. Specific issues, silo working. Again, this goes back to what I said about implementation planning. We have seen in a number of mergers, many years post-merger, where people will still say, well, that's the X organisation stock, so we don't deal with that, or that's dealt with under such and such policies. And you kind of say, well, you're one legal organisation now, and they go, oh yeah, but we don't use that policy for that. You know, as in there is integration is hard, don't get me wrong, but silo working is what causes issues around compliance, not to be identified or risks to fall in the gaps. Health and safety I've talked about, particularly around different approaches to compliance that we've seen, and that has caused a variety of issues on mergers. I could name Shoreline, Green Square, there's loads of examples out there where health and safety issues were either flushed out as part of the merger process as part of DD, and so we've realised there is an issue that we didn't realise was there before, or things were found out afterwards in terms of people thinking that their approach to compliance was correct, and then it turned out not necessarily to be, and therefore things had to be done to deal with that post-merger. Rent standard, I've mentioned before, is a common issue inside and outside of merger processes, but it is something that quite often gets flushed out on mergers because of the due diligence process. Complaints, so we've obviously had the Housing Ombudsman special report around mergers. Thinking about complaints handling is obviously key. It's a very good indicator of culture, as we know, but also a good indicator of how good the services that are being provided are ultimately being received by those residents. So a specific thing to look at, particularly on recent mergers, has been around complaints handling, compliance with the code. What are you doing about dealing with that? What's the implementation and action plan around complaints as a merged organisation? And then lastly, resident consultation and engagement. You'll probably have seen, for example, on the Tower Hamlets Poplar Harker merger, which was ultimately abortive, they received a challenge around resident consultation. There is a much bigger regulatory focus in the new environment around hearing the resident voice and how you're engaging with residents at a formative stage. And clearly within the much bigger structures, a big thing is about how do you hear the resident voice when you are 80,000 units spread across X number of local authorities. So a key thing is thinking about how you're going to build that into your merger planning process. And it's not just we have a customer committee. It's also how do we make sure local issues are being identified and addressed. It's not about individuals, and it shouldn't be about individuals. So it shouldn't be about who gets the top job or who gets the chair role, or am I going to stay on the board, or all those kind of conversations, which sadly still do happen on a number of mergers. But you do ultimately have to think about, what's the impact of losing people on the business? How do you make sure staff are kept happy, as I said? So individuals do play a role in it. And then finally, being prepared to say no, or this is no longer a go. More and more now mergers, we see kind of a gateways process. So there'll be various go, no go stages throughout the merger. And they are planned more carefully now because we have seen, as you'll be aware, a higher percentage of mergers not going ahead. And I will say that's a number of reasons. I mean, there were mergers that didn't go ahead before, but you didn't necessarily get to see about them because people didn't have to disclose them because they didn't have a bond, whereas you do where you have a bond, you have public disclosure requirements. But being clear about, when are we going to say no? When would we walk away from this? What would we need to say to be able to proceed to the next stage? And I think that is something that's really important, particularly for boards, because you can get swept up in the, it's an exciting project. We're going to deliver 5,000 new homes every year for the next however many years. We've spent X amount of money. We can't walk away from this now. But I think there has to be that reality about sometimes no is the right answer on mergers. And I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious we've got about 10 minutes for conversation. So sorry.
No. Look, thank you both, and thank you for a lot of information. I think it's really, really valuable. I've got a number of the points raised here in the chat that I want to kind of bring to the session. If anybody would like to dive in, yes, Steve, do feel free, and then I'll go to the chat while I'm bringing this up. So, Steve, welcome, and do feel free to come in.
Hi, thanks. Just want to bring up to follow on several points of what's already been put in the chat.
Yeah.
Mergers are great from a financial point of view. You only mentioned tenants on the last page of lessons learned. Why aren't tenants brought in at the start of the merger? Tenants need to know how the mergers are going to affect them. Also, when you get mergers, there are going to be cost savings, which means probably merging customer service centres, other services, etc., etc. So there's going to be a loss of staff. What impact is that going to have on tenants? What about the vulnerable tenants? If you merge customer service centres, it's going to be in one area. If the merged organisations cover a wide area, is there going to be that loss of personal contact, especially when the merger includes a smaller housing association?
Thanks, Steve. I'm aware of time. I'm going to make sure we bring in Colin, because I know Colin's raised a lot of the points in the chat. And then I'm going to go to Gemma with those points.
Just one other thing that I want to bring in, which is important. This is especially true when you consider that the sector is thinking about bringing in AI. What about the vulnerable tenants?
Thank you, Steve. Colin, please do in, because I can see a number of the points I was going to raise from what you've put in the chat, but obviously bring them in yourself, and then we'll go back to Gemma and Sharon.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I've been a resident for over a number of mergers. All have been bad for tenants. None have been good. I'm categorical in that. The communication post-merger gets worse. So that if you have a concern, you end up having to spend hours on the phone waiting to get through to the call centre. When you do get through to the call centre, most of the time, because it's miles away, have no local knowledge, which makes the situation worse. And please, will you stop calling it units, stock, houses? These are homes. Homes are where people live and have emotional attachment to them. When people like yourself start talking about units and stocks and houses and buildings and stuff, what it does is it takes it into the corporate world. Unfortunately, the corporate world doesn't live in them. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Gemma, a couple of pushbacks. I think one of the key things that I would, just before I bring Gemma back in, is I don't think in any way, Gemma, you've advocated for mergers being a solution. I think that there's been a balance there, and also I can only speak from obviously my experience working with Devonshire's, was that was something that was being hammered into us from day dot. Was the case of, look, I mean, we were two small providers merging into one, but there was an RP status and other things going. But Gemma was constantly pushing back, saying, you know, is this going to work? How much due diligence has been done? But there's only so much you can do, I guess, when you're merging. And yet we've seen from the chat this that Rachel said that when she worked for one of the UK's biggest associations 10 years ago, small association merged into big, but moved back to a small one because that loss of community focus was there. And Gemma, I know this is something you're hearing all the time. So what are your thoughts on kind of Colin and Steve and some of the points that were raised there?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Colin, I hope I didn't say unit. I don't use that phrase generally. So my background is I am a social housing tenant. I grew up in a Midland Heart property, ironically. So again, I went through mergers in Midland Heart as a tenant, and I sit on the board of a community-based organisation, a housing association, and I don't like the phrase units because you're right. Ultimately, it's someone's house at the end of the day. And in terms of the reference to residents, you know, I think I've tried to stress throughout the ultimate thing should be the focus on customers and what services you're providing, because if you're not providing a better service at the end of the day through the merger, then what's the point of it? There isn't any point at all. You know, we're only there for one reason, aren't we, as housing associations? It's to deliver a good, safe home to our residents and good services. So if that's not coming out of the merger, there isn't any point going ahead with it. I think you're right. I mean, generally, mergers have been assessed historically on balance sheet considerations, absolutely. And I think that's largely because business cases have historically been presented to funders, and you know, you're selling something to the funders in terms of getting their consent for mergers, and you're saying, you know, here's how it adds up from a financial perspective. But it can't just be about that, and it has to be about services. That sounds like a broken record. I think in terms of improvements to services, there are pros and cons, and I think there are some mergers I've seen that have worked well, and there are some that have not worked so well. So for example, the Shepherd's Bush merger, I mean, it's only 8 months in, but already, you know, they've been able to get the money they wanted to invest in IT so that they can have an app for their residents so that people can book a repair in the middle of the night and track where their repair worker is. You know, they wanted to do it so they could do those kind of things that they had no hope of being able to achieve on their own, and they would never have had the money to do. And in honesty, you know, as I said before, they were selling off properties because that was the only way they could continue to survive as an organisation. And that's not doing what you're there to do as a housing association. You know, you're ultimately taking properties out of the social housing stock and put them in the hands of private individuals, you know, quite often landlords who are letting them on the commercial commercial market. So I think there are pros and cons. Absolutely, you're right. There have been situations where mergers have created organisations which have been remote from their residents, and we are seeing that again and again. And I hope that that is a trend that is being booked against in the sector. I mean, I think if you look at things like, I'm not saying L&Q is one of those, but you look at L&Q saying we are taking money out of our development programme and really investing it in how we provide our services and what we're doing in terms of repairs to our properties. That's the right thing to do, isn't it? And we do need to see a bit more of that. I think that's a wider picture, not necessarily just a merger, of what housing associations thought they should be focusing on, as in delivering new units for the sector, and not necessarily focusing on a continued basis of, are we doing the right thing? Is this what our residents actually want? Are we getting that feedback from them, and are we doing well? But I do think I'm happy to see that on recent mergers, there's a much bigger focus on how do we get residents engaged throughout the process, generally much earlier than we've seen before. Picking up on your previous comment, there is a bit of a difficult balance on that, because if you have a bond, for example, you can't say from day one to residents, we are looking at a merger. You can only do that at the point that you go out and tell the bond market we are looking at a merger, because otherwise you break your legal requirements essentially. But what we are seeing is at a very early stage, resident groups are getting involved in terms of what should our governance structure look like, how do we engage with customers going forward, what should be our first 5-year focus on services in terms of what we're improving. And I think that's a really good thing to see. And there are some great examples. I mean, the Eastlight one is a clear one, where residents have really been involved throughout the process in terms of co-creation, which I know sounds a little bit jargony, but how do we make sure we deliver an organisation with our residents that is what they need going forward?
There's been a really interesting point made in the chat around some of that, actually, from Sarah Jackson, who said, I hope that one of the key considerations for boards when thinking of merger is understanding each other's position in relation to compliance, whether that be regulatory, and how this is evidenced, and what assurance measures the board have in relation to this. I'm sure that one of the areas of compliance at the forefront of consideration will also be compliance with the new RSH consumer standards, how this can be evidenced. Culture drives compliance and approach to compliance. I think a question that I'd had sent anonymously, which I just wanted to raise, which was, do you think that the TSMs and the TSM results and everything we're getting in that space is going to have an impact on who businesses choose to merge with, because it's so much more, I guess it's evidenced more openly in terms of businesses might say, oh yeah, we do this, we do that, look at our due diligence, we do X, Y, Z, whereas actually this is showing from almost a tenant perspective, actually what tenants and residents and customers think of the business that they live in.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, being cold and candid, if you've got a very good TSM score and you're looking to merge with someone who's got a poor TSM score, you've got to think about what the ultimate impact is going to be on your score, isn't it, by bringing the two together? You are looking at a net detraction in terms of your service. Now, maybe there are things you can do to improve that. So we've seen, for example, some organisations had clear reasons why they had a massive issue around complaints, because they'd had an issue with a provider, it hadn't been managed well, they'd ended the contract, there was a clear thing about trying to move that forward, and you could see the correlation there. But I think it's something we're already seeing coming into considerations about how well are you delivering those services. What scores are you getting on your transactional surveys in terms of repairs from residents, and are they matching up with what we're doing? As I said before, I think it's a clear indicator of culture, isn't it? And Sarah's point about compliance is a good one. You have to think about how you can address those weaknesses. Is it realistic that together you can move those scores up to a point that's acceptable? I don't think you can just say no because they've got a lower TSM score than you. I don't think that's what you're suggesting, Matt, but I do think it's a good kind of empirical status in terms of culture and how well you're dealing with those points, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, Claire Patson had mentioned earlier that silo working is a problem in all housing, not just in merged organisation. It just multiplies with a merger, which I think goes to one of the points you mentioned earlier. Steve has said there's also the potential loss of non-core services the sector has taken on by governments, cutting funds to social needs, such as job advice, health needs, financial advice. Yeah. That's a whole nother session that I know we can absolutely deep dive into. And Jess Rattigan had just mentioned there, it's a catch-22. Without the funding, smaller organisations cannot support or give the tenants the home they're needed, but does feel that partnerships are key supportive for tenants and organisations alike. And I think that was really important that Sharon mentioned earlier. There are ways, it isn't just merger, no merger. There are many steps along that journey. I'm aware we've run out of time. Obviously, there's a lot of information to download. Please do reach out to Gemma and Sharon if there are key follow-ups and things like that. What's the best way to get in touch with you both, Gemma?
Happy to share the slides, and they've got our contact details at the end if everyone wants to have a look at those, or get in touch through the website. Really happy to have a follow-on chat if anyone's interested. That's great.
Thank you to both of you. Next week is a 90-minute roundtable special, because we've got the CIH joining us to discuss the new planning reform. So that's another quite heavy session. So do be prepared, but lots coming through there. But I would just like to say a massive thank you to Gemma, to Sharon, to Devonshire for supporting today, but also, as I said before, that I've only had one experience of going through a merger, and the amount of information that was thrown at us was it was heavy, but was so necessary to make sure it was the right business that we were partnering with, and that the right services for tenants was continued. So thanks again, Gemma, for helping us through that wonderful process. But for now, if you did miss any, do please follow up on the recording. Gemma, Sharon, thank you for today, and thank you to everyone who's new to the roundtable and has returned for more sessions. So cheers, thank you all.